Tonight, we're going to have a discussion on what we think about what's been happening in Bangladesh. It's over a month now, 5th of August, that the Prime Minister Hasina had to, who actually been in power for 15 years, had to had to resign and flee the country. Started with weeks of protests of students, um, spending a lot of time, study, making sacrifices, and then not having access to jobs and the increasing dictatorial position of the Prime Minister. So Ed's going to introduce what lay behind the events and whether the students have actually, one, achieved anything, who's in charge at the moment. Ed Potts, who comrades, I think all comrades know, will be introducing it. He's going to speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll take the usual questions. Forgot to introduce myself. I think everybody here knows me, but I'm Soraya Lawrence, and I'm going to facilitate the discussion tonight. So welcome everybody, and Ed.
Go. So thanks very much, Soraya. As Soraya said, the jumping off point for this talk today is the protests in Bangladesh, which began in June of this year and really reached their climax on the 5th of August of this year, as Soraya said. On which date the Prime Minister of Bangladesh had to resign from office and flee the country after a significant wave of protests. So that's really the starting point of the discussion. But I want to obviously think about what it is we can learn from it, and what lessons it has when we encounter similar protest movements and movements against repression, and what we as communists should be doing and saying and thinking about in those situations. So by way of a very brief factual background, I hope that people might have had a chance to either read something of their own accord about the subject, or read some of the articles that were circulated in advance of the discussion. That's something that we will be making an effort to do in advance of these discussions more and more, I think, in the future. But if you haven't, not to worry. I'll give a very brief overview of the factual background. So the modern state of Bangladesh was originally East Bengal and then East Pakistan, which after the independence of India from Britain was in fact an integral part of the state of Pakistan, two roughly equal in population halves of the country, which were not at all joined together territorially. In fact, they had around 1,000 miles or more of what is now the state of India in between them, but nonetheless, those two halves both part of Pakistan. Um, they may have been quite similar in population size, but there were significant disparities between them in terms of economic development, social prestige, and the political weight attached to each within the context of the state as it was at the time. There was a rising tide of Bengali nationalism within East Pakistan, and that really reached its crux in 1970, around 1970. In general elections in that year, in which one of the major parties, the Awami League, won almost all of the seats in East Pakistan, and therefore, by extension, actually had a majority in Pakistan as a whole, but was blocked from forming a government, and by essentially by elite forces and ruling class forces in West Pakistan, the modern state of Pakistan as we know it. What then followed from there was a significant deterioration in the situation. Acts of genocidal repression followed, in which the army of Pakistan killed hundreds of thousands of people, many more killed and indeed raped during the months that followed, until the end of 1971, when the state of Bangladesh, as it became known, finally achieved its independence. The leading politician, who was regarded as essentially the father of the nation, Sheikh Mujib, was assassinated in 1975 in the course of a military coup. And that's a recurring feature of Bangladesh politics since its since independence. It spent a significant number of periods under either direct or indirect military rule and governance. But his daughter was Sheikh Hasina, who, as Soraya mentioned, later became a significant politician and prime minister in her own right. In terms of what gave rise to these protests in this year, there's been a long-standing movement in the country against a government policy which allocates a quota of 1/3, or well, 30% of civil service jobs to the relatives of veterans of that 1971 War of Independence. And now, in a country where of course, there's been significant economic development, but nonetheless, there is still significant poverty in the country. Of course, the civil service entrance exam was seen as a key driver of social mobility, and therefore a perceived lack of meritocracy in that exam and in access to civil service jobs was really, really important. Now, originally, that policy gave a 30% quota to those who were themselves veterans of the War of Independence, and as well as 10% quota to women who had been raped during that war, and 40% reserved to residents of so-called underrepresented districts. And what this meant was that there were only around 20% of civil service jobs which were open in a meritocratic pool, so to speak. In 2010, the policy was extended after a number of extensions. It extended to include the grandchildren of those people. And so the people who the policy was benefiting was no longer even limited to those who had themselves fought or suffered in the War of Liberation, but their grandchildren. And this only heightened the perceived injustices of many people in the population. So there were, as I say, a long-standing movement against it, significant challenges to it. But in June of this year, legal challenges to it through the court system finally reached their conclusion, and the Supreme Court of Bangladesh ruled that those quotas were legal and they would remain in place. What this sparked off was a renewed student-led movement, which demonstrated and brought out large numbers of people onto the streets and into demonstrations on university campuses against the quota system and calling for more meritocratic access to civil service jobs. What this was met with was really significant repression by the ruling party, the Awami League, and by forces of the state as well. During these protests, at various times, the government repeatedly cut off access to the internet and social media across various parts of the country, which is, I think, a really significant development and something that we should really be thinking carefully about, which I'll come back to later. The demands of the movement really developed as the state repression developed and as the crackdown got more intense. They crystallized into a list of demands for apologies, accountability, as well as the abolition of the quotas. And when the protests continued and the repression continued and the demands hadn't been met, eventually by the 3rd of August, it was decided that they would be reduced to a single demand, which was the resignation of the Prime Minister and her cabinet. And until that was achieved, there would be a programme of non-cooperation. And that was really a really extensive programme of non-cooperation. I'll just read some excerpts from what was being put forward: non-payment of taxes and duties, non-payment of utility bills, all government and private institutions will be closed, no one will go to work. Same goes for textile industries, mass transportation will remain closed. And so really what was being proposed, even if not necessarily implemented uniformly, was on the level of a general strike. And so in less than 48 hours, they'd achieved their aim, and the Prime Minister had to flee the country and gave up office. Now, following this, to fill the political vacuum, the military has stepped in. And so the Chief of Staff of the Army convened a meeting of representatives of major parties. And effectively, what they did was engineered an interim government led by a man called Muhammad Yunus, maybe familiar to some of you, he's known in the West as a pioneer of so-called microfinance initiatives, and these are beloved of advocates of neoliberalism because they're small loans, and the idea is if you give somebody a small loan and improve their access to credit, they'll create a small business for themselves and lift themselves out of poverty. The truth of that, obviously, questionable to what extent it works, but that's what he's known for in this country. He was a subject of significant persecution himself by Sheikh Hasina's government, including various trumped-up charges and prosecutions. But more importantly, he was obviously a favourite of the Western ruling classes. He regularly met with American presidents, spoke at economic summits, and so on. In other words, he and his government and the political solution that it represents have not just come from nowhere, let alone an organic expression of the mass movement. The international community have clearly played an active role in what's gone on here. And we can see that in the last few weeks as well, and indeed in the last few days. In the last 24 hours, in fact, a high level US delegation has held talks with leaders of the new government and agreed $200 million worth of aid to Bangladesh. And this is, of course, clearly aimed at shoring up American influence in the country, which, as well as significant American economic ties, has also had very close economic links and infrastructural investment from Russia and China in recent years. And so there's clearly a great concern there. And all of the great powers are maneuvering for influence in this uncertain situation. So that very brief whistle stop talk brings us more or less up to date. And so in terms of the issues that it raises for us, I'm going to deal first just with some practical or technical points because those are perhaps the most obvious. What we know, of course, is that the explosion of digital communication in the modern age has, in principle, afforded us as a movement the means to reach a much greater number of people today than was ever the case before. We can reach people quicker and easier than before. But there are significant limitations to that, especially from a technical standpoint, because, of course, all of the major communication channels which the working class movement currently relies on physical infrastructure such as cables, cell towers, Wi-Fi networks, and indeed on platforms and software such as Facebook or WhatsApp or Instagram or Twitter, which are either owned by the state or by the capitalist class itself. And that's a huge problem for us. The risks to that are obvious and have been demonstrated again and again, at least as far back as the Arab Spring protests across various countries in the Middle East. The state in any given country is able, if they wish, to simply turn off a hostile movement's means of communication. Despite there being developments which make it technically feasible, our movement hasn't yet really taken advantage of the capacity for alternative means of communication and information. Although we are beginning to see this emerging, such as the protest movements in Hong Kong, which made use of mesh networks and P2P messaging systems. The obvious danger, of course, is that if we only turn to such means of communication once it seems necessary, that may in reality be too late. And so we need to think carefully about equipping ourselves with what we need, independent of the ruling class. And this isn't a question, I should say, that only arises in dictatorships or in very limited democracies. There was a recent global survey by Ipsos Mori, which suggested that among various other countries, in the UK, 25% of people strongly agree that temporarily cutting off social media platforms is acceptable at times of crisis to stop the spread of false information. And a further 44% somewhat agree with that statement. So that's a total of 69% at least somewhat agree that it may be acceptable to turn off social media platforms in times of crisis. So moving on then to the political questions, I think the key one here for us is the question of the state. Of course, we need to hammer home the point that the state is not a neutral actor. It may appear to be or claim to be neutral, at least on the terrain of party politics. So, for example, between a dispute between two ruling class parties, but it's definitely not neutral in relation to the really important struggle, the class struggle between the working class and the capitalist class, and in relation to the struggle for democratic rights within which the working class and the socialist movement are the leading force and the key beneficiaries. I think also it's important for us to recognize that protests, and especially mass protests, which turn into a mass movement against state repression, as we saw in Bangladesh, have the potential to provoke a real crisis for the ruling class. They can result in a change of government, in wide ranging constitutional changes, and significant concessions being brought to bear. But I would say that protests in themselves are really unlikely to be sufficient for the change that we need to see, which is the working class taking power, because what they don't do is really equip the working class to take on or neutralize the most repressive aspects of the state. And by that, I mean the security services and the military. So it's likely to become more and more important the more that a given government loses control of the situation, because, of course, in those situations, the ruling class will need to resort to whatever force is capable of restoring order and restoring profitable functioning of the economy. The ruling class is not going to tolerate a situation like that being proposed by the non-cooperation movement in Bangladesh, where workplaces remain closed. It's not going to accept it. Um, I'm just going to move on so that I get through this in good time. I think the most important thing that we should be doing as communists in that situation where a mass movement of that kind arises is we should be thinking about what we can do to arm that movement, and that means both ideologically and materially to achieve that movement's objectives. So what that means, I would say, is where movements against this or that injustice or oppression arise, then we should be intervening in them. But we shouldn't do so uncritically. We shouldn't simply be cheerleaders or aim to swim with the swim downstream. We should analyze them and criticize them where necessary, and patiently explain why, in many or most cases, the problems to be addressed and the problems raised can't actually be solved within class society. To solve most of the problems raised by movements like this, you need to go beyond the limits of class society, beyond capitalism. And so we need to explain that and explain why ultimately achieving the aims of that movement is going to require a political struggle for communism. And so one of our key tasks is going to be intervention to raise the political level of the movement in question. It also means that we're going to need to intervene to raise the level of organisation and preparedness. So that means we need to learn the lessons of history, not only from very recent history like Bangladesh, but applying everything we've learned from the experiences of different countries and different struggles of our movement. Everything we've learned about state repression and ways of combating it, and then passing on those lessons to others. It means we need to encourage the better use of infrastructure and communications. It means we need to always be putting forward ways in which movements in which we're involved can be better organized. And as well, it will also mean opposing ideas which are counterproductive, like horizontalism, which may appear superficially attractive, but in reality will not result in power being in greater hands, but rather fewer. What we also need to do, I would say, is offer much needed context. Protest movement or an organization which prioritizes protest may struggle to pursue tactics other than protests, even when it's in fact appropriate to do so, when it's appropriate perhaps to pause protests or to retreat temporarily or take stock or indeed pursue other tactics entirely. It may not be in a position to do that because, of course, the protests themselves are what have brought people into that movement and brought them together thus far. So what we need is an alternative to that, a complementary alternative. What we need is a durable organisation, a party with an agreed upon programme, with democratic structures, with real links to the mass movements and organisations of our class and arising out of our class, such that that organisation, that party is capable of listening and responding to what's going on, and more importantly, can assist beyond the ebb and flow of a particular protest wave. And so it shouldn't be that when a mass movement like this erupts, then it simply dissipates once certain of its demands have been achieved or once the situation cools down a bit. We need strong, durable organizations that persist beyond that. And I think as a perhaps an example, we only need to consider in this country what might have emerged, what could have emerged out of the million-strong protests against the Iraq War had we had a suitable organisation capable of persisting in that way, raising the level of those protests and guiding them into something more long-term. Most importantly, what we need is a party, a communist party with a comprehensive programme, not just designed to address this or that need or this or that injustice, but instead talking about the transformation of society as a whole, with members who are convinced of that programme, well versed in it, and confident and capable of explaining it to others and convincing them as well. So that's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ed. Thank you for that introduction. We've had some comrades who've arrived a little later, but depending on how late you arrived, it's a discussion on Bangladesh, recent events in Bangladesh, and then the more wider question of the need for a party, revolutionary party, the working class. So ask if usual format, questions, contributions. We initially limit the contributions to 3 minutes, so in the hope that everybody will be able to speak. And if everybody doesn't, then there's always a second turn and sometimes even a third. Has anybody got any short questions? Okay, well, I can see Toby's hand is up, and Toby, fire away. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Toby, yeah.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, thanks. Yes.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, I'm old enough to remember the War of Liberation, and therefore had a certain sympathy for the Awami League, particularly compared with the Bangladeshi National Party, and even worse, Jamaat-e-Islami, which definitely colluded with the genocide. And therefore, I accept that there are massive problems with Sheikh Hasina and with the Awami League, but the main opposition lot are Islamicists, people who would therefore be likely to attack women's rights and all the rest of it. I mean, I do not think that we can ignore the question of it's better to have a relatively secular regime rather than a fundamentalist Islamicist regime. And during the turbulence in August, I'm not saying attacks on the Hindu minority in Bangladesh were, the predominant thing at all, but there were attacks on the Hindu minority in the overthrow of Sheikh Hasina's regime. Then there are a couple of other things. The textile workers, I mean, the most oppressed section of the working class in Bangladesh, female textile workers. You remember the factory that burnt down, and I think there's a famous one, but there have also been others. And therefore, I'm interested as to whether those workers were in any sense involved on one side or another in this, or whether they, more or less were ignored it. Now, so then there's the question of the poor peasantry. Obviously, there are poor peasants in Bangladesh. They aren't all industrial workers, even in textiles. And the last thing that sort of occurs to me is that insofar as there was any tradition at any point to the left of the Awami League, it seemed to be some variant of Maoism. And I think that one of those organizations still existed in relatively recent times. Maybe it could even be 10 years ago now. So I'm curious as to whether they still exist and whether they had anything to say during this upheaval. I think that's about it. I know you might all think I'm being soft on the Awami League, in part possibly because I have certain sympathy for Sheikh Hasina's niece, who I think was a good MP. I don't know what she's like at the moment under Starmerism, but certainly her campaign for the Iranian woman was very impressive. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Toby. So, anything flowing from that? Any further questions? Will, unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether, I mean,
I seem to have moved.
Just for, sorry, Toby, don't forget to mute. Yes, yes. Will, you've muted yourself. That's it. That's it.
that happened. Anyway,
start again.
like me to mute myself. I was just wondering a couple of things, really. One is, I mean, actually picking up some of the stuff that Toby was talking about, really, which is, were we looking at what kind of, I mean, I'm trying to work out what kind of movement it was, okay? Because in one sense, it looks to me like there was, people had sat in, the Awami League had sat in power for quite a long time, that they had become so embedded that aspects of quite a lot of corruption had crept into their practice. And that in the end, it was like a popular movement that was the main point of the popular movement, the democratic point, and that was it. And they'd gone so far that they completely minoritized themselves as a political current, the Army League. Or is there any suggestion at all in the sense that Toby was saying that there was an ideological intervention from I hate the term Islamists, but Islamic fundamentalists who wanted to see a different kind of social structure and a different kind of social order. Did you pick anything up about that, Ed? Was there anything going on about that? And also on the other side is the question of the left. And I scooted around a bit, but I found, I mean, as Toby was saying, there was it mostly seems to be like sub-Stalinist, upfront Stalinists, Maoists, and that kind of stuff. And there doesn't seem to be any other left currents or revolutionary Marxist currents there, unless I've missed it. So is your sense one of it was a democratic movement that was the Awami League was so marginalised that they were going to be blown over anyway because they pissed so many people off, let me put it that way. Or was there something else going on underneath, as Toby's suggestion? And are there any left forces that we would recognise as left forces, which is increasingly difficult to find around the world these days? But anyway, were they there and we've just not heard about them?
Thanks, Will. Nick, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Thanks very much, Ed. That's a very informative introduction, and I've done a little bit of reading, but it is difficult to get to grips with it in a short space of time. I've also looked around. I can't see really any significant workers' organisation, a political organisation, other than those that have generally been described by Will. I think the largest one that I could see was the Workers' Party of Bangladesh, which is sort of former incarnation was the Communist Party, but had actually stood in elections with the Awami League. My reading of the Awami League and Sheikh Hasina's leadership of it, and the 15 years that she spent in government, and she'd previously been in government for a previous term of office, was that all the papers that I've read basically state that she had become more and more and more autocratic. It was essentially a one-party rule. The BNP, which I agree with Toby, is a right-wing party, but it had been suppressed. 20,000 of its members had been arrested before the elections. Essentially, they then boycotted the election, if I understand correctly, and the Awami League itself allowed essentially pretend candidates. I can't think of a different word, but not really serious or significant candidates to stand against them in order to give the illusion that the election was fair. And it seems to me that it's been universally condemned. So prior to the election, when she was going for her 5th term of the office and she won, it was a fraudulent election. It had been marked by repression. There were extrajudicial killings. The opposition was essentially marginalized, wasn't allowed free speech, suppression of the right to assemble, and so on. So it seems to me that the movement of the students arising out of the protests, as Ed has explained, of opposition to the quota, against the quota system, against the background of poverty, corruption, unemployment, growing disparity between the incomes, a lack of a voice, a political voice to give expression to that anger, frustration, marginalization, erupted when the quota system was essentially sanctioned by the Supreme Court, and it erupted. And it seems completely genuine, but it had no channel, it had no direction. I've been asked to wind up, so I'll come back later.
Thanks very much, Nick. I can see Kirsty's put in the chat, Bangladeshi militants have joined wars in Libya, Palestine, Iraq, and Syria, etc., defined as the Ummah. Does this mean they would be more of Islamist militants? That cannot be good. Janet.
Yeah, thanks. Just a very quick question about the military. Given what you were saying about the state, obviously, how come the military allowed this to happen? I mean, whoever they were and whatever they did, presumably they wanted it to happen or they would have stopped it. So I don't know much about it, but I mean, I assume they were not happy with the stability of what's her name? Names I can't remember, the existing.
Shani.
Yeah, that was just a quick question, really.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. I can't see any hands up at the moment. Ed, do you want to come back on a couple of these points for a few minutes?
I can do, yeah. Obviously a number of people have raised the sort of balance of forces, which is obviously something very important. And I think it's right to say that in terms of an organised left, the forces of the socialist movement in Bangladesh are in a very difficult state. However, they are perhaps not significantly further behind than we are, because hundreds of thousands of people vote for them in various party forms at elections. Clearly, the history of the country with various periods under state repression and military dictatorship has played a significant role in that. I agree with Toby to some extent in the sense that clearly many of the forces who were involved in this movement and or attached themselves to it are not ones that we as communists would support. However, to some extent, I think I would make the overarching point that when you have a very broad-based mass movement, it's going to be the reactionary forces will inevitably attach themselves to it. They'd have to be daft not to, and that applies to domestic, homegrown reactionaries just as much as it does to those under foreign sponsorship, which is why I think it takes us nowhere. As people sometimes do, I'm not saying this is what Toby has done by any means, but it seems to be a common hobby among many of the left to pick over reports of various protests in different countries, be they in the Arab world or in Hong Kong, for example, and find examples of where people are clearly sponsored by CIA, and then use that to draw some kind of conclusion about the movement as a whole. When it's, to me, blindingly obvious that, of course, those forces would seek to steer and guide in whatever way they can, and there's often very little that can be done to stop it. Whether that really tells you anything about the movement as a whole is perhaps more up for debate. Janet's question, I made a note of it here. How come the military allowed this to happen? Well, I think the dynamic of the movement as time went on is really the key question there, because of course what's happened in the early stages of this protest movement from June onwards was that the protesters were met with significant state repression, including by the state security forces. So there were various forms of repression that people encountered on the university campuses. A lot of it was essentially organised thugs under the auspices of the Awami League student organisation. But then on the streets as well, of course, they had the police and the security services and to some extent the military as well, playing a role in trying to suppress the protests. What changed in the dynamic as time went on is, of course, the increasing destabilization, and clearly at some point leading forces in the military, no doubt with contacts in other sections of society and elsewhere abroad outside the country, have concluded that there was simply no stability and no economic stability to be gained or regained under Sheikh Hasina's government, and they've taken that opportunity to sever ties with her. So I think it's, of course, the military of Bangladesh has no qualms whatsoever about crushing a student movement or a protest movement or any kind of movement in favour of democracy. They've done it countless times throughout the country's history, but they've clearly seen which way the wind is blowing in this particular case. They've seen that the Awami League have lost control of the situation, and so they've acted in the way they have. Is how I read the situation in any case.
Okay, thanks for that, Ed. Any more questions, contributions? Minnie, is that you leaning forward to put your hand up?
Yeah. Thank you, Ed. I thought that was a really interesting discussion, and particularly the end when you're talking about the left, or generally setting up a party, a communist party with a program. But I've just got a question. It's just a quick one about the divide and rule tactic. Is it correct that there's the Islam, sort of Muslim religion, and the Hindu religion in Bangladesh? And is there a movement to sort of break off for the Hindus? For safety reasons, I don't know. I don't really understand what's going on in that country. What's happening now? Are they under martial law? What sort of restrictions do they have on them? Social media especially. But I thought your point about technology and access to media and how the ruling class can just turn it off is a really, really vital point for our movement to get hold of. We need to, I've said this before, we really do need our own social media. We need to be able to get Wi-Fi for ourselves, and we need to start building relationships with and getting comrades from those kind of industries, the computer sector, and from engineers and all sorts. We need to think about infrastructure, and that needs to be a big part of this party that we're going to build. It's interesting, the fake news aspect in this country. There's been an article recently in the Observer, was it, that where the Labour right are now sort of out and proud that they took Corbyn down. He flew too close to the sun, was the headline in this article. But also, it's amazing the information you get from technology. And as regards the links with the CIA, the second shooter, the second Trump shooter, people managed to archive his social media before the powers that be could take it down. So there's archives of, and it's clear that he's linked to the CIA. It's absolutely credible. And he's pro-Ukraine, and he's made a pro-Azov battalion, is that the right-wing battalion video, and there's connections with the other shooter. It's absolutely fascinating, the network the ruling class has, and we need to network. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minnie. Thank you. Nick.
Thanks, Soraya. I just wanted to come back on one of the points that Toby raised, because it's an important issue. If I understood Toby correctly, basically Toby was saying, because of the threat of the Islamic fundamentalist opposition, Toby had some sympathy for the Awami League. Hope I haven't distorted the position. In my opinion, this may be a common position amongst many, but I think it's profoundly mistaken, because we should have the attitude and try to promulgate the attitude in situations like this that the working class should not be making a choice between one reactionary right-wing force as opposed to another reactionary right-wing force. And in my opinion, what we see in Bangladesh at the moment is exactly that. The Awami League should be given no support whatsoever. It's basically a very poor country, but it's also the second largest exporter of textiles or garments. It's very close to China and India. It exports a lot to America. So it's a sort of, there's a battleground over who's got influence in it. Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister, was close to India. They're upset that she's been deposed, that she's fled. She fled to India. She now wants to come back. But the Awami League that she presided over, for the reasons that I explained earlier, is thoroughly reactionary and cannot be supported by the working class or any of us socialists. Of course, I agree with Toby that the forces of Islamic fundamentalists should not be given any support either. And if we've learned lessons from the Arab Spring or the developments in Egypt or the Sudan, we can see that if the working class does not develop its own independent working class political program, the vacuum in society will be filled by one of those other forces. And that's what the ruling class in Bangladesh is trying to do now. The military who backed Hasina eventually were forced by the protest movement to call quits on her and tell her it was time for her to go. So that's why she went. She was essentially pushed out by the military, who then tried to stabilize things. And into that vacuum, essentially, the naivety of the movement played into their hands. And the students essentially, after they'd said Hasina's got to go and she went, there was no other programmatic demand apart from what they came up with, that they wanted Muhammad Yunus, the individual that Ed's spoken about, to lead the interim government before new elections. Ed's explained why he's not somebody who we would support. And that's why Ed's point about the political party is so important. The programme and the support for the programme can't be sucked out of our thumb in the middle of these events. It's got to be built in advance, over time, patiently. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Sorry about that. It's just I've seen that Ian has posted something, and I'm going to try and encourage him to come in on it rather than me reading it out. Ian, would you be able to do that, even if you can't stay for long? Do you think you'd be able to?
Oh, all right then. It was right, okay. I just wanted to say I'll get this in front of me. I won't read it verbatim, but to give me a heads up. Yeah, I can't agree with Toby that Hasina's niece is a good MP, even in the Free Nazanin campaign that he mentioned, and I'd support that, obviously. But I remember very shocking footage of her threatening Alex Thompson, the Channel 4 News journalist, on camera for asking questions. She said she'd accuse him of being a racist, and is it just because I'm a Bangladeshi and the like. When he was asking about a jailed British Bangladeshi dissident and would she speak up for him? And she said he's not my constituent, it's not my issue. And of course, her aunt was the Prime Minister, as though it's not just like she's of that nationality and he was being discriminatory in that way. She did have some sort of locus, and just the way she was doing it, it didn't appeal to me. And I think now she's actually a minister in Starmer's government. When there was talk of Hasina fleeing to Britain and getting banned from coming here, I think I said in one of my WhatsApps, does that make her like the King of England in 1917, banning the Tsar from his cousin from coming to Britain after he got ousted? Maybe not quite, but yeah, it's. I can't agree that she was a particularly good MP. I think she was pretty much on the other side of the Labour stuff, and I didn't like her approach to Alex Thompson on Bangladesh and on her aunt's long dictatorial record by that stage. But I just wanted to say one last thing on top of that, that just because I think I agree with Nick, we should be hard on the Awami League and that the uprising was genuine, doesn't mean that, especially in this kind of power vacuum that's being described with the lack of a left alternative party, that the US at all won't try and fill the vacuum with something that could be even worse or less independent. That doesn't mean they got it all up in the first place, that it is a risk. So yeah, that's we'll have to look at both aspects of that. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say in the chat. Thanks for having me in.
Thank you very much, Ian. Those were some really interesting points, and so I appreciate you you actually voicing them as well as putting them in the chat. Thank you very much, Janet.
Yeah, just a question which is kind of off-piste, really, or not. I don't know if it's relevant, but interesting. I find it's interesting. If Ed would say, if there's any possibility after the US election, if Trump loses by a very close margin, or he says he does, is there any possibility that there'll be obviously nothing like Bangladesh, but there'd be, these two capitalist parties actually, I mean, what happened in January was last time was frightening. And if that happens again, but on a much larger scale, I'm not saying it's going to, and I don't know if it will, but if it did, do you think there's anybody in the States who's thinking along those lines? I mean, I've seen like the Green Party isn't. I mean, they're pushing forward their views particularly around Palestine, but I don't suppose they're thinking about, and they're not social. I don't know if they're socialists. I don't think they're socialists, but is it a totally fantasy position to think that could happen?
No.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm not interrupting you, Janet. No. Oh, you've muted yourself. Had you finished?
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think that's you voiced a concern of many people having seen what happened last time. Yeah, that's a whole new debate. Will.
Yeah, it's funny, Janet, because I was thinking about a similar thing, really. But the context in which I was thinking of it was there it's like getting the coordinates of where we are right, because a lot of people, particularly, can I say older people? Is that all right? Have been used to coordinates of, the Eastern European bloc, Soviet Union, all that kind of stuff, and anti-American, anti-imperialism against the Americans and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. And that's actually quite a bit like a football match. If you wanted to make a football match, two sides, which I'm not sure was ever the correct way to think about it anyway. But what we've got now is there's a whole series of countries where parties in power are beginning to erode actually bourgeois democratic principles, actually, um, and to make it very difficult for opponents to stand. And they do it over time. Yeah. So that's clearly what was going on in Bangladesh. We've seen Putin do the same thing in Russia. We've seen very much the same thing in Iran. There's a big argument now, and maybe we should have a discussion on this at some point about what's happening in Venezuela. Yeah. So the question of in the kind of post-Cold War period, people who are kind of getting their coordinates wrong and backing aside if the Americans are in favor of the opposition or appear to be in favor of the opposition. And so this is kind of leading me to the question is we need to kind of have a general think about democratic demands, what kind of democratic revolutions or anti-democratic movements are we expecting to see in this period when there isn't a socialist pole, actually, neither China nor Russia, there's no socialist pole. And how does Marxists and socialists operate in that situation? Because it's almost inevitable, if there is a inter-imperialist struggle going on, that the United States will be involved in movements against repressive regimes. They will want to be in there, finding their class allies, helping them build a movement for democracy that delivers the country into the alliance of the United States. Yeah. And so that makes it quite, in one way, it's simple. We're in favor of democratic revolutions and against anti-democratic movements. But how do we operate in those circumstances, and how would we have operated in Bangladesh? How would we operate in Russia? What would our line be beyond calling for a socialist revolution? And how do we make that workable, and how do we think that through? And that also immediately, because you start thinking about the normal narrative about the East being reactionary and all that kind of stuff. Of course, you then come to the Republican agenda, well, not the Republican agenda, but the Agenda 2025 that's being backed by Trump supporters and the Heritage Foundation, which, if it was to be put into action, would basically eviscerate federal government and you'd have government by presidential decree. And they are serious about this, actually. And we would find ourselves in the camp of the Democrats. Now, whether we be in the same place in defense of democracy, but what would we be arguing for? Yeah, what would our arguments be in that situation? And I think we're going to face more and more of this. We had it with Iran, we saw a lot of equivocation over the movements in Iran and the democratic protests in Iran, because you can be very supportive of the women's movement in Iran, yeah, who, and the fights that they've had and the democratic struggles around women's rights and support them 100%. But actually, if you went on, you saw some of the demonstrations I was in France at the time, and I noticed there were these demonstrations against the Iranian regime, which were headed up by Iranian royalists, yeah, and they combined themselves with the Ukrainian nationalists. And you're thinking, what would our intervention be? Would we even want to be on those demonstrations? Would we set up our own demonstrations? What would communists and Marxists do in those circumstances? So we face, I think, really tricky period in terms of how do we support democratic movements, but not subsume ourselves within broader bourgeois movements or bourgeois democratic movements, if you know what I mean. How do we work that?
Thanks, Will. Thanks very much. Any other questions? Anybody who hasn't spoken? Steve, Virginia. Steve, is that your hand going up?
No, it's just to say I'm finding it very interesting, but I've not done any background reading, so I'm just sort of doing a watching, listening brief this evening, but very, very interesting. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Steve. Virginia, I can see you commented. Very good question. Do you want to ask any questions yourself?
No, but I just think that that's a very good question that will raise. It definitely does have to be further discussed. That's all I really
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Nick.
I'm going to come in on Will's question, and I think that everybody else in this discussion must have a view, and we can only develop the discussion by people coming in and expressing the view, even if you then change your mind. But my opinion or answer to Will's question is, communists are the only consistent Democrats, and we should not allow a wing of the bourgeois ruling class to present themselves as Democrats in order to maintain their control over society and the economy. And we need to keep pointing out that their so-called democracy is not democracy at all, and that they have intervened repeatedly to prop up autocratic, dictatorial states when it suits them. And that's going on at the moment, and that's what they'll do in Bangladesh. And so you can see why the students, in the absence of any sort of communist direction or socialist direction, might look to somebody like this liberal, so-called liberal millionaire to head the interim government. He's got the Nobel Peace Prize. You know, he is feted by the media and so on. But I think we have to say, no, we've got no time for this individual. And we should counterpose our democracy, our democratic demands for theirs. The election of all officials, the right of recall, the payment of the average worker to MPs, rotation of jobs. These are not democratic demands that any wing of the bourgeois society would go along with. If there's a vote on an issue in Parliament, then and we had people in it, of course, we'd cast our vote against any erosion of democracy and for any limitation, for any prevention of an erosion in democracy. But we should counterpose completely separate demands and explain to the working class that the only way that we can actually protect and extend democracy is by changing the nature of society. I think something that's always lacking in the discussion about democracy as well is, how can you have a truly democratic society when a tiny proportion of the population own entirely the means of production, the land, the factories, the science, the technology, the water? So a key element of, in my opinion, democratic demands has got to be democratic control over the economy, and that means common ownership. It means communism. So I think we just need to keep pursuing that, and tactically, yes, we can dance and we can maneuver, but our idea of democracy is completely different from even the most liberal wing of the bourgeois society.
Thanks, Nick. Minnie.
Yeah, just quickly adding on to what Nick said there. There's no democracy in the media, and the media is owned by what? A tiny clique of billionaires, the mainstream media. And that statistic that, for example, Ed came up with, that people are pro shutting down the media, if there's a fake news, if there's a big crisis going on or something, or even a small crisis, it's people are just sort of, there's so much fake news put out by the ruling class. That's what I'm saying. Their propaganda is wall to wall fake news, really. And so we really do need to counter that. It's huge. And get our own propaganda out there, as people have been saying.
Thanks, Minnie. I think well, I don't know how people are thinking when they say they support the idea of some sort of control, but I think that there's an idea that we do live in a democracy. We know as communist socialists, we know it's a bourgeois democracy, so it's as democratic as the ruling class wants it to be when it suits them. But people believe that there is a democracy and therefore there's some sort of impartial arbiter who will oversee this. There's a desire not to have fake news, but it's also, in my view, quite naive, the idea that there's somebody there who's going to be completely impartial controlling this. And of course, what we know that it will be to control to suit the ruling class. So Kirsty has just posted, agree, Minnie, we need a new platform and agenda to help the workers and working class. Even our Prime Minister just now is not helping Britain. And then Nick's posted, in the situation when Boris Johnson tried to suspend Parliament during the Brexit votes and bypass Parliament, it was quite right to oppose Johnson's erosion of the limited democratic rights that we have. Yeah. That's a blatant example of the suspension of democracy when it suits those who are in power, when things aren't going the way they want them to go. I think I'm going to call Ed back in unless anybody else has a burning point to make, or even a short question. Will, sorry.
All right, I didn't use the electronic hand, but thinking about what Nick was saying in terms of, it was right to kind of oppose Johnson's erosion of the limited democratic rights. I mean, yeah, absolutely. But to be honest, and I'm, pointing the finger at myself as much as anybody else, we were sat there agog at what was going on in Parliament and all the knife edge stuff that was going on and the debates that were going on and Johnson's attempt to stop them, basically. But did any of the left at that point, right, alongside saying, well, actually, that what Johnson's doing needs to be stopped, yeah, which showed his direction of travel in general, I think, not too far from Trump. Do you know what I mean? Not too far from Trump. But did any of us then go, well, actually, although we are opposed to what Johnson's doing, and the law courts were brought in to, stop it, did any of us raise questions about the kind of democracy that we were living in and how fragile it is? Because we were a law court ruling away from something really quite bad happening. And did the left have anything to say about that and to say about alternative forms of democracy that would prevent that happening? And I'm not sure I saw that, actually. And exactly, Minnie, exactly the case about Macron as well. Macron has just kind of overturned the French constitution. The Italians had somebody put into post by the European, by the Commission, a decade ago. He was just brought in to, you're going to be the president, the Prime Minister of Italy. So there has been lots, and we got Orban, what Orban is doing in Hungary. So we've got lots and lots of examples now, I think, of where the incursion into bourgeois democratic rights is happening. But for what I can see, we see the left defending bourgeois democracy. And this is not a criticism of anybody in particular, but just of us as a layer, I think, and not putting the arguments for an alternative form of democracy. We don't even seem to be ready for it. And we need to be ready for it, I think.
Thanks, Will. Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any answers, but I mean, in Britain, you can oppose the restriction of the fuel allowance, even though the Tories also allegedly support the restriction of the fuel allowance. But what do you do? I mean, it's in terms of just. I think the answer is only one has to keep discussing it. I mean, not just that, but if you, the example of Iran, where you have, you know, the anti-head wearing a headscarf, you know, movement among women in Iran, and yet, as Will pointed out, you have royalists who are being pushed as being an alternative to the mullahs, which is not great. It's not it's not as easy in Iran to sort of say do the equivalent of what you can do in Britain to be against the restriction of the fuel allowance, to be against their government, and even, you know, lots of people in Iran, according to people like Yasmin Mather, I mean, are cynical about the regime in Iran supporting Palestinians, because so many hate the regime so much they just regard that as, you know, proper bullshit on the part of the Iranian regime. So I mean, it's so much more difficult if you're in Iran. So what do you do if you're not in Iran, and you do have, you know, the ability to speak out here against, you know, as I was just saying, you know, restrictions on the fuel allowance, even though the Tories supported it, and you anyway, we socialists would go further than that. But I mean, it's the dilemma that's posed, and what you do apart from a program, obviously, but you just have to keep talking, don't you? I mean, getting a lot of information out there, seems to me. Yeah.
Thanks, Virginia. Yeah. So we've had some more in the chat about Minnie's given the example of Macron, who has completely ignored the election results and just imposed who he wants as the as Prime Minister, and of course he has that power. And as Nick has said, when it comes to the working class threatening power, the ruling class will be prepared to suspend democratic rights to prevent the working class coming to power. And I think that's right. Kirsty's just raised on the issue of the winter fuel payment that Virginia raised, that 53 Labour Party MPs abstained in the on the vote, and Kirsty says they should be sacked, and I completely agree. So they certainly didn't get elected to attack working class people, although of course that's precisely what Starmer is doing and will continue to do, and he is going to privatise the National Health Service. I think that's quite clear to everybody. I'm just looking at the time. I think, unless, having said this once already, not wanting to stop anybody from making another contribution, but Virginia, yeah.
I guess my question was kind of directed at what I understand. I didn't quite understand what Nick Rack was saying about what do you do in a situation? Obviously you propose a working class, so a socialist revolutionary program, or you know, but what do you have to say specifically about the dilemma in a place like Iran, or not just Iran? Or did I misunderstand what you were getting at in relation to what Will had said, basically?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just give Nick, can you just respond to that very briefly? I know
Yes.
it's a long discussion, but if you could, just so that Ed has enough time.
Well, just very, very directly, communists have to defend every single aspect of democratic gains that we have won. They've all been won through struggle, whether it's the right to vote, the right to free speech, the right to assemble, to form trade unions, to wear whatever clothes we want, and so on. They've all been won through struggle, and we should be the most consistent and ardent defenders of those rights, as well as at the same time showing that there is a society in which we won't need to protect those rights because they will be automatic and built into the society that we want to achieve.
Thank you. Fair enough. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks. That's very, very concise, Nick. Thank you indeed. Ed, big task, lots and lots of different strands to the discussion this evening. So do you think you could manage that in 10?
Certainly try.
And
I'm grateful actually to everybody who's been really active in the chat throughout the discussion, because a lot has emerged there in terms of factual clarifications about the situation and indeed other experiences as well. So I think that's really important. In terms of, I think one of the main issues that's arisen is the purposes that protests can be deployed for, and what we do and how we react to it. And Janet raised a point about the potential for mass protests in the event of if I understood correctly, in the event that Trump is re-elected, the potential for mass protests resisting that. I don't really want to get into the facts of America on the ground.
It doesn't get re-elected.
If he doesn't,
but it's very.
okay.
He says it's very.
Well, I'll respond in a slightly different way then, but I think the arguments that I'm going to make are more or less the same. I think Trumpism was a mass movement in that it completely obliterated the establishment Republicans. It left them in the dust. And I think it's really striking that being the case, 4 years on, really the only people who were prepared to come out and do anything when he said that the election had been stolen from him were a sort of ragtag band of weirdos in quite small numbers overall. And I think that that's significant. I think it tells us something about protest and what people are willing to come out on the streets for. I think it tells us that they are, by their nature, quite transient and fragile, and people are really not inclined to come out if they don't think they're going to be successful, especially if they think that they might face repression. And of course, there's all kinds of factors in each different situation which might apply and which change the calculus of it. But I think that that's really significant there. One thing I also wanted to raise was, of course, the habit that seems to have emerged of people calling protests outside Downing Street when the Tories win an election. And within hours of the Tories winning an election, somebody calls a protest saying, "Get the Tories out, get rid of the Tories." And I think that is really fundamentally misguided, because the only thing, in my view, less legitimate than bourgeois election, with all its defects and all of its weighting in favour of the forces of the ruling class and all of the flaws that we know about, the only thing less legitimate than that is an even tinier minority movement thinking that it can simply skip over all of that, jump over the need to patiently build support of the majority in society and impose their will upon the population. And it's a trap that some people on the left, unfortunately, fall into again and again. And it's often for very understandable reasons, because, of course, we're in a desperate class war. Our class is under constant attack. Our living standards are under attack. But it is a mistake nonetheless. And I think we need to be alive to them. We need to pursue politics and a set of tactics and strategy which focuses on building the support of the majority and how we get there. not taking shortcuts towards that, not watering down our program to gain the ear of the majority quicker or more effectively, but how we put forward the change that we really need to see and how we get towards the majority supporting that. And I think protest plays a role in that, but it can be quite a limited role ultimately. A lot's been said about what we would be doing on the ground in a situation like this, what we might be doing or saying in Bangladesh. I think Virginia made exactly the right point, and others echoed it as well. We in this country agree with keeping the winter fuel allowance as a bare minimum, even though the Tories are cynically in favour of it as well. And I think that shows an important lesson for us, because the presence of reactionary forces or forces that are vacillating shouldn't be the key question for us. Because if our approach was on any given protest or any given action, that if somebody turns up who's a reactionary or who has distasteful ideas or who we don't like, we would simply pack up and go home, then these actions, these protests would simply never happen, and we certainly would never get anywhere. Instead, what we need to show is that we are capable of taking on people with those ideas. We are capable of showing that our ideas are better than theirs, and we are capable of winning over the majority and defeating those reactionaries in that way. And I think that is, in general, the cornerstone of our approach. One part of our approach as communists, I think, has to be organising communists together. That means obviously developing an organisation and also arguing for the unity of communists. We've obviously touched on the divided nature of the left in Bangladesh, which is, of course, quite familiar to us as a concept in this country. And of course, we can't solve the problems of the left in this country or any other country by simply getting all of the groups into one building and one organisation. But we should be making the argument for principled communist unity, not on a lowest common denominator program, which simply puts forward a few basic reforms we can all agree on, but instead on a full program, overcoming our differences, learning how to talk to each other and how to organise together effectively, and forging unity in a real sense in that way. In terms of intervening into movements like this, movements which may be quite limited in their objectives, and who our assessment is that they don't go far enough, or don't have their horizons set high enough towards achieving what they want to achieve and what we want to achieve as well. I think our intervention is something like this. We need to find ways of engaging people and arguing with people that what we should be talking about is not only getting rid of this or that hated or authoritarian government, so not only getting rid of Sheikh Hasina or not only getting the Tories out, but what change would be needed to prevent such an authoritarian government emerging ever again. And I think from that kind of conversation, of course, it's not as simple as those two sentences. It's a long series of conversations in reality. But what emerges from that kind of conversation is that you can only achieve only achieve the change that you want to achieve, which makes permanent changes to society with the support of the majority in society, which is, of course, the working class, organised collectively, conscious of its own strength and power, and with its own programme for running society in the interests of everybody. I think that being said, we need to think about how people in fact perceive democracy and particularly democratic legitimacy. We need to constantly think about making arguments for a better form of democracy, but also thinking about how people genuinely value and are prepared to go to significant lengths to defend the democracy, the limited democracy that we already have, which Nick spoke very well on. I think that's a really important point, because ultimately our class is very practical, and we need to correspondingly be be practical as well. We need to be constantly thinking about, have we got the right ideas, but also are we conveying them in a practical way so that people can take them and use them to the purposes which they're intended. I think I'm going to stop there. So thanks very much, everybody, and I've really appreciated the discussion.
Gosh, thank you very much, Ed. That was really concise. I wasn't expecting that you'd be so quick. Thank you, and thank you everybody for contributing to the discussion. It's a huge task that we have, but it can't be avoided. We're seeing every day with everything that's going on in the world just how essential it is that there is a genuine communist workers opposition, and that's the only way that, in fact, the working class are going to take power, because again we see when there are movements, it's so easy for them to be dissipated either by the obvious enemies or the those who work within the unions and the so-called workers' parties to sabotage them. So just before I close the meeting, I just wanted to remind everybody of the agenda of discussions that has been circulated, but the next discussion on the 30th of September will be introduced by Will McMahon, looking at the first 100 days of Starmer's Labour government. We've already seen how wonderful it is. Then on the 14th of October, discussion on Israel-Palestine, 1 year of genocide and the threat of a regional Middle East war. 28th of October, Nick Rack will be speaking on the crisis in the water industry and that it's a demonstration that the capitalist class is not fit to rule. 11th of November, we'll have had the outcome of the US elections on the 5th, and we'll see who will be the new president, what it means for the class struggle, for war, the prospects for socialism in the US. And then we will be moving on to new topics up to the end of the following two, the last two discussions of the year. So please do send us your suggestions as to what you'd like us to discuss, and also if there is a topic that you would like to speak on. We'd love to have more people contributing to the I mean, you all contribute to the discussions, but actually introducing the discussions, that would be very welcome. Everybody here has a wealth of experience. In that case, I shall close the meeting.